the question that changes everything. There is a number that very few people ever stop to think about. It sits quietly at the edge of everything we call civilization, everything we call progress, everything we think we know about who we are and where we came from. That number is 2%. 2%. That is the portion of the human story that is written down. The portion we can read, the portion that has names and dates and maps and monuments. The kings and empires and philosophers and wars that filled the history books you studied in school. All of that, every single word of it, covers only the last 5,000 years. And yet modern human beings, anatomically identical to you and to me, have walked this earth for over 300,000 years, which means 98% of the human story has no history book, no written record, no named author, almost no monuments that survived. It is a vast and largely silent expanse of time, deeper than civilization, deeper than agriculture, deeper than the first city or the first king or the first written law. A darkness so wide that the entire span of recorded history, from the earliest Egyptian hieroglyphs to the present moment, would vanish inside it like a single candle flame swallowed by an ocean night. So where were we during all that time? What were we doing for the 295,000 years before someone picked up a reed and pressed a symbol into wet clay? The answer is not nothing. Far from it. Tonight, we are going back past the pyramids and the Roman roads and the Greek philosophers, back past the first farms and the first villages, back past the cave paintings and the bone flutes, back to the very beginning of the human story, to the long, quiet, astonishing age before history began. And what you find there, if you look carefully, is not emptiness. What you find is everything. If you are listening to this as you settle towards sleep, that is exactly what this channel is made for. And if this kind of quiet journey through deep time is something you want more of, a gentle tap on the subscribe button means you will never miss a night like this one. Chapter 1. The First People. 300,000 years of being human. Let the mind drift for a moment to a hillside in what is now northern Africa. The year is approximately 300,000 years ago. A small group of people moves across an open landscape under a sun that looks exactly the same as the one that rose this morning. They walk upright. They carry tools. They speak to one another in some form of language we will never hear. And if you could somehow stand among them, look into their faces, you would see something startling. They look like us, not almost like us, not vaguely human in the way an early sketch resembles a finished portrait. They have the same high-rounded skulls, the same flat faces, the same distinctive chin that sets our species apart from every human lineage that came before. These are anatomically modern human beings, Homo sapiens, and they are living their lives on a planet that has no cities, no writing, no agriculture, no metal, no wheels, and no calendar to mark the passing of centuries. This is where the story begins. For a long time, scientists believed our species emerged around 200,000 years ago, most likely in a single location in eastern Africa, probably in what is now Ethiopia. That was already an astonishing number. 200,000 years is long enough to make the entire age of recorded history seem like an afterthought. But in 2017, a discovery in Morocco shattered even that timeline. At a fossil site called Jebel Irhoud, researchers recovered skulls and bones from at least 5 individuals. When they analyzed these remains using the most precise dating methods available, the numbers that came back were not 200,000 years. They were 315,000 years. The oldest confirmed fossils of our own species, and they were found not in eastern Africa, but in the northwest, suggesting that the true story of human origins was never a simple tale of one population in one place. Instead, it appears that our ancestors emerged gradually across an entire continent, multiple populations spread over vast distances, exchanging genes and innovations through networks of contact and migration, all slowly converging on the anatomical blueprint that we now carry in our own bodies. This realization changes everything about how we understand human origins. We were not born in a single cradle. We were born across a continent. Africa was our entire nursery. But here is the question that genuinely haunts the researchers who study this period. Having a modern body does not automatically mean having a modern mind. The brain inside those 300,000-year-old skulls was the same size as the one inside your own head. The neural architecture was comparable. But was the thinking comparable? Were those early Homo sapiens capable of the same abstract reasoning, the same symbolic thought, the same capacity for art and language and religion and philosophy that defines human consciousness today? This is one of the most difficult questions in all of science, and the honest answer is that we do not fully know. The archaeological record from this earliest period offers very few clear answers. There are stone tools, carefully crafted and well-designed, but not dramatically different from the tools being made by other human species at the same time. There is evidence of hunting and food processing. There is evidence of fire use. But for the first 100,000 years or more of our species' existence, the physical record does not obviously announce the presence of creatures who were dramatically different from their close cousins, the Neanderthals in Europe, the Denisovans in Asia, the various other human lineages that shared the planet with us during this deep and complicated chapter of prehistory. And yet, something was different. Something had to be, because our ancestors survived when all the others eventually did not. The question is what that difference was, and when it began to express itself in ways that left traces in the ground for future researchers to discover. The first hints appear around 200,000 years ago in the form of a mineral that ancient humans seem to have found irresistible across every continent and every era: red ochre. This iron-rich clay, which produces a vivid spectrum of red, orange, and yellow pigments, begins appearing at human sites in ways that cannot be explained by practical necessity alone. It has no nutritional value. It cannot be used to make tools. The only plausible explanation for the consistent, deliberate processing and collection of ochre at these ancient sites is symbolic. People were using it to color things, their bodies, their tools, objects of apparent significance. They were making marks in the world that had no survival function. They were doing something with meaning. Around 100,000 years ago, the evidence grows stronger still. Carefully perforated shell beads begin appearing at sites in North Africa and the Middle East. These tiny objects, each one requiring time and skill to create, are unambiguous signals of symbolic thought. A bead is not just a decoration, it is a communication. When you wear a bead, you are making a statement about who you are, which group you belong to, what status you hold, perhaps what events you have survived, or what ceremonies you have undergone. The bead carries meaning that exists entirely in the shared imagination of the people who understand it. That is abstract thought. That is a specifically human kind of cognition. And then, around 100,000 years ago, and possibly earlier at certain sites, a behavior appears in the record that marks perhaps the most significant threshold in the entire human story. Intentional burial of the dead. Not every ancient human bone found in a sheltered location represents a deliberate burial, but some sites from this period show unmistakable evidence of intentionality, bodies positioned with care, oriented in specific directions, sometimes with objects placed beside them. The act of burial requires a particular kind of understanding, an understanding of death as a permanent transition, a recognition that the person who is present is no longer present in the same way. And the deliberate arrangement of a grave suggests something further still. It suggests that the people performing this act believed the arrangement mattered, that it would affect something, that there was a reality beyond the visible one that deserved acknowledgement. This is the first faint stirring of what will eventually become religion, philosophy, and art. The first time any creature on earth paused at the edge of death and tried to do something about it that went beyond the merely practical. Picture the scene. Someone in the band has died, a child perhaps, or an elder whose knowledge everyone depended on. The group pauses. They do not simply leave the body and move on, as most animals would. They dig. With stone tools, in hard earth, they dig a hole that takes hours of difficult labor. They lower the body carefully. They arrange the limbs in a position that seems important to them, though we cannot know why. Perhaps they place something in the grave, a tool, a piece of food, a handful of ochre. Perhaps they speak. Perhaps they sing. Then they cover the grave, and they remember where it is, and perhaps they return to it. None of that is survival behavior. None of it helps them find food or escape predators or protect their children. It is something else entirely. It is the first evidence that at least some of our ancestors had crossed the threshold into a kind of awareness that would eventually produce every religion, every myth, every piece of art, every philosophical tradition that human civilization has ever created. The awareness that existence has meaning. Now, understanding who our ancestors were during this earliest period also requires understanding who they shared the world with. Because for most of the time that modern humans have existed, we were not the only humans. Not even close. Between 300,000 years ago and perhaps 40,000 years ago, the Earth was home to at least 5 distinct human species, all living simultaneously, all making tools, all using fire, all probably communicating in some form of language, all adapted to different regions and environmental conditions. The Neanderthals ruled Europe and Western Asia, their stocky, powerful bodies perfectly suited to cold climates and ice age conditions. They were not primitive brutes. Modern research has established beyond serious doubt that Neanderthals created art, deliberately buried their dead, manufactured complex composite tools, and possessed cognitive abilities that overlapped substantially with our own. In some measures, brain size in particular, they actually exceeded us. The Denisovans are a more mysterious lineage, known primarily from DNA extracted out of a handful of fragments discovered in a cave in Siberia's Altai Mountains. The physical evidence for this group is frustratingly sparse, but their genetic signature is anything but sparse. Denisovan DNA turns up in modern human populations from Tibet to Melanesia, and the proportions are not trivial. Some populations in New Guinea and Australia carry as much as 5% Denisovan ancestry. These were real people, widespread across vast stretches of Asia, capable of interbreeding with both modern humans and Neanderthals, a fact confirmed by the discovery of a young girl who was the direct offspring of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. Her bones recovered from the same Siberian cave where the Denisovan lineage was first identified. The other human species of this period are less well known, but equally remarkable in their own ways. On the Indonesian island of Flores, a population of very small-bodied humans, Homo floresiensis, sometimes called the hobbits of prehistory, persisted until perhaps 50,000 years ago, hunting pygmy elephants and giant rodents with sophisticated stone tools despite having brains. considerably smaller than those of modern humans. In the Philippines, another previously unknown species called Homo luzonensis left behind bones dated to approximately 67,000 years ago. And in South Africa, the perplexing Homo naledi, a species with a bizarre mixture of ancient and modern anatomical features, appears to have survived until at least 230,000 years ago, potentially overlapping in time and space with early Homo sapiens. This was a genuinely diverse world of humans. Multiple lineages, each with its own adaptations, its own tools, its own apparent traditions and behaviors. And our ancestors knew them, encountered them, in some cases lived near them for thousands of years, competed with them for resources, and, as the genetic evidence makes abundantly clear, sometimes had children with them. The Neanderthal genes that most people of non-African ancestry carry in their DNA are not some distant theoretical inheritance. They represent real encounters, real relationships between real people. Somewhere in the tens of thousands of years of human prehistory, a modern human and a Neanderthal met, and the result of that meeting is still present, in a small but measurable way, inside the genome of every person today who traces any part of their ancestry to Europe or Asia. By roughly 40,000 years ago, all of the other human species had disappeared. The Neanderthals were gone. The Denisovans were gone. Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, Homo luzonensis, all gone. Only one human lineage remained. Ours. Why? This is perhaps the most haunting question in all of human prehistory, and it does not have a clear answer. It was not because we were more intelligent in any simple, straightforward sense. Neanderthals were cognitively sophisticated. It was not because we made better tools, at least not initially. Other species made tools that were remarkably similar to ours. It was not because we were larger or physically stronger. Neanderthals were more powerful than modern humans by virtually any physical measure. Some researchers point to the size and structure of our social networks. Modern humans seem to have maintained larger, more fluid social groups than Neanderthals, with more extensive long-distance connections allowing information, innovation, and resources to flow between communities separated by hundreds of miles. Others emphasize language, not just the presence of language, which multiple human species may have had in some form, but the particular richness and flexibility of modern human language, its capacity for infinite combination, for describing things not present, for telling stories about the past, and the future, and the imaginary. Others still suggest the most honest answer may simply be that we were luckier, that the accidents of climate change and ecological disruption happened to fall harder on Neanderthal territories than on ours, that in the lottery of survival during a volatile and unpredictable ice age, our ancestors happened to draw better cards. The truth may be some combination of all of these factors, or something else entirely that we have not yet identified. What matters, for the purposes of tonight's journey, is simply to recognize the profound strangeness of this fact. For most of human history, we were not alone. We shared the planet with other people who were different from us, but recognizably, unmistakably human. And then, in the space of a relatively few thousand years, they were all gone, and we were all that remained. We are the survivors of that narrowing, the sole remaining branch of a once diverse human family tree. And everything we call civilization, every city and every language and every artwork and every scientific discovery, everything we have created in the last 10,000 years was built by the descendants of the people who remained standing when all the others fell away. That is worth sitting with, in the quiet, as the night deepens around you. We are the last ones, and what we do with that singular inheritance is still, in so many ways, being decided. Chapter 2. The Original Affluent Society: How Our Ancestors Actually Lived. there is an image of prehistoric life that sits so deeply embedded in the modern imagination that most people never question it. The caveman. Half-stooped, grunting, dragging a club through a hostile world, surviving hour to hour in conditions of unrelenting misery and deprivation. A creature barely above the animals, always hungry, always cold, always terrified, dying young in a world without mercy or comfort. This image is, in almost every important respect, wrong. Not just slightly wrong or exaggerated wrong, but fundamentally, comprehensively wrong in ways that carry significant consequences for how we understand ourselves, our history, and our present-day lives. The people living 50,000 years ago were not primitive versions of us waiting for civilization to arrive and make them fully human. They were fully human already. Their brains were identical to ours in every meaningful way. Their capacity for language, for emotion, for creativity, for problem solving, for love and grief and wonder and humor, all of it was present, complete, functional. If you could take a baby born in a hunter-gatherer camp 50,000 years ago and raise that child in a modern city, she would grow up indistinguishable from any other contemporary human being. She could learn mathematics and music and literature. She could master technology. She would dream the same kinds of dreams, feel the same kinds of longings, struggle with the same kinds of existential questions. The hardware was already there. It had been there for a very long time. Understanding this, truly understanding it, requires setting aside almost everything the popular imagination associates with the Stone Age. Let us try to reconstruct, as honestly and carefully as the evidence allows, what a typical day actually looked like for one of your direct ancestors during the period that represents the vast majority of human history. You wake as the sky begins to lighten, not from an alarm, but from the deep synchronization between your nervous system and the natural light cycle that governs all human biology. You have slept perhaps 9 hours, possibly more during winter months when nights are long, curled close to the people nearest you for warmth and the unconscious reassurance of proximity. Your sleep was probably not a single continuous block. Research on sleep patterns in contemporary hunter-gatherer communities, as well as analysis of historical sleep records before the industrial era, suggests that the uninterrupted 8-hour sleep familiar to modern people is actually a recent and somewhat artificial invention. Your ancestors likely woke once or twice in the night, tended the fire, exchanged quiet words with whoever else was awake, then settled back into sleep. This interrupted pattern is not a sign of poor health. It is simply the ancestral human rhythm, perfectly calibrated to conditions that no longer apply to most of us. The morning's first task is something to eat. And here is where the first surprise arrives. You are not desperate for food. You are not scrambling in a panic of perpetual scarcity. The analysis of bones from hunter-gatherer populations consistently shows levels of nutrition that compare favorably to, and in many cases exceed, those seen in early agricultural populations. You eat from the previous day's stores, dried meat, perhaps, or a cache of nuts and tubers. You eat enough to feel satisfied. Then you turn your attention to the day's work. And that work, by modern standards, is remarkably brief. The anthropologist Marshall Solins, who spent decades studying hunter-gatherer societies worldwide, made an observation that remains one of the most genuinely startling findings in the entire field. Among the various contemporary foraging peoples he studied, the Tung San of the Kalahari Desert, the Hadza of Tanzania, indigenous communities in Australia, groups in equatorial Africa, the average number of hours spent obtaining food each day was somewhere between 3 and 5 hours. Not 8, not 10, 3 to 5. Which means that after the morning's gathering or hunting work was complete, the bulk of the waking day remained. And what did our ancestors do with all that time? They rested. They socialized. They played with their children. They made things. They told stories. They slept again in the afternoon when the heat of the day made outdoor activity unpleasant. They sat together in groups and engaged in the kinds of slow, easy conversation that is one of the most reliable sources of human well-being, and that most of us, in our frantically scheduled modern lives, almost never have enough of. Solons called this the original affluent society. Not affluent in the sense of accumulating things. Our ancestors owned almost nothing by modern standards. And they moved camp often enough that owning many things would have been a burden rather than a benefit. But affluent in the only sense that ultimately matters, their basic needs were consistently met, and they had abundant time left over to simply be alive. Now, the work they did do was not simple or unskilled. Far from it. The knowledge required to successfully gather plant foods in a wild landscape is staggering in its depth and specificity. A skilled gatherer, the role performed most often, though not exclusively, by women in most hunter-gatherer societies, carried in her memory a detailed catalog of hundreds of plant species. She knew which parts of each plant were edible and which were toxic. She knew which plants had edible roots in early spring, but toxic leaves in midsummer. She knew how to process certain seeds or roots that are poisonous in their raw state, but become nutritious after extended soaking or careful cooking. She knew where each species grew in the local landscape, which soil conditions it preferred, which companion plants typically grew nearby, how weather patterns in previous weeks would affect its current availability. This was not vague traditional knowledge. It was precise, detailed, empirically grounded information that had been tested and refined over countless generations. It was botany. It was ecology. It was nutrition science. It just had not yet been given those names, and it was stored in human memory rather than printed in books. Hunting required an equally sophisticated knowledge base. Tracking an animal through varied terrain, reading the subtle impressions of feet in different substrates, interpreting the meaning of bent grass and disturbed leaves and the dried edges of a water source recently visited, required the ability to mentally reconstruct an animal's movements from hours or days earlier and project them forward to predict where that animal would be now. The best trackers were, in effect, expert field biologists with deep knowledge of the behavioral ecology of their prey species. They understood seasonal patterns, mating behaviors, feeding preferences, flight responses, and the ways that weather and terrain affected animal movement. They could read a landscape the way a skilled musician reads a score, extracting meaning from details invisible to the untrained eye. Hunting was also a profoundly social activity. Coordinated group hunts, involving multiple individuals working in carefully choreographed roles across extended terrain, required sophisticated communication, advanced planning, the ability to signal intentions silently across distances, and a level of mutual trust and shared understanding that comes only from long acquaintance and sustained cooperation. This was not instinctive herd behavior of the kind seen in wolves or lions. It was planned, deliberate, strategically creative human cooperation. The health picture painted by the skeletal record is genuinely surprising to most people who encounter it for the first time. Hunter-gatherer remains show strikingly low rates of tooth decay compared to the populations that followed them. They show fewer signs of the bone malformations associated with nutritional deficiency. They show less evidence of the kinds of repetitive strain injuries that agricultural labor produces in spades. The spine damage, the joint wear, the asymmetrical muscle development that comes from performing the same physical motion thousands of times a day in the same position. And they show greater average height than the farming populations that eventually replaced them. The average height of Europeans dropped noticeably after agriculture was adopted and only began recovering toward pre-agricultural norms during the 20th century. What hunter-gatherers were vulnerable to was the kind of acute injury that primitive medicine could not adequately address. A broken bone, improperly set, could become a long-term or permanent disability. An infected wound, without antibiotics, could kill a healthy adult within days. The dangers of childbirth without surgical intervention were significant, and childhood was genuinely dangerous in ways that have been greatly reduced by modern sanitation and vaccination. But if you survived to adulthood, and more people did than the stereotype suggests, you had a reasonable chance of living into your 60s or 70s. The idea that everyone died at 30 in prehistoric times is a misunderstanding rooted in the mathematics of averaging mortality rates across ages. When infant and childhood deaths are included in the calculation, average life expectancy drops dramatically even in populations where many adults live long lives. Our ancestors did not all die young. Many of them grew old. The social structure of these communities was as different from modern life as everything else about them. The typical band, the basic social unit of hunter-gatherer life worldwide, contained somewhere between 20 and 50 people, all related to one another either by blood or by marriage, all known to one another intimately from birth. There were no strangers in this world. Everyone around you was someone whose face you had known for as long as you could remember, someone whose habits and moods and skills you understood as well as you understood your own. Within these bands, the social organization was markedly egalitarian, not because prehistoric people had more enlightened values than their descendants, but because the structural conditions that produce and sustain inequality simply did not exist. You cannot accumulate wealth when you are constantly moving. You cannot claim land when your entire territory extends for hundreds of miles in every direction and is shared informally with neighboring bands. You cannot maintain coercive authority when the people you would dominate have the option of simply walking away and joining another group, as they routinely did when social tensions grew too great. Leadership in hunter-gatherer bands was characteristically situational and informal. The most skilled hunter led the hunt. The most experienced gatherer guided the search for plant foods. The eldest and most respected members of the community offered counsel on matters that touched on accumulated wisdom. But none of these roles conferred permanent authority, and none of them exempted their holders from the obligations that bound every member of the group. The most distinguished hunter still had to share the kill. The most respected elder still had to do their share of the community's work. Child rearing in these communities was a collective enterprise in ways that would look extraordinary to modern eyes. Every child was, in a very real sense, the child of the entire band. Multiple adults, grandparents, aunts, uncles, older siblings, unrelated community members, all contributed actively to the care, feeding, protection, and education of every child in the group. Anthropologists call this alloparenting, and there is strong evidence that it is the ancestral human condition. The isolated nuclear family, in which two parents bear nearly total responsibility for the care of their children with minimal structural support from a wider community, is a very recent and historically anomalous arrangement. Our children's needs and our own psychological responses to those needs were shaped by an assumption of collective caregiving that most modern societies have largely dismantled. The education these children received was as rigorous as anything offered in a modern school. if radically different in its methods and its setting. By the time a young person reached adulthood in a hunter-gatherer band, they possessed a body of knowledge that would take a modern specialist years of dedicated study to acquire just a fraction of. They knew the landscape of their territory in extraordinary detail, every water source, every food-bearing plant, every seasonal variation in animal movement, every sheltered camping spot, every dangerous terrain feature. They knew how to process dozens of different foods. They knew how to make tools from available materials, how to maintain and repair those tools, how to build shelters adequate for the range of weather conditions they might encounter. They knew the basics of medicine, which plants treated which conditions, how to set broken bones, how to manage fever and infection with available resources. They could navigate across hundreds of miles of open landscape using the stars, the sun, the wind, and the subtle directional cues encoded in the behavior of animals and plants. They also knew their community's entire body of oral tradition, its stories, its songs, its social rules, its history or what served as history in a world without writing, its cosmology, its understanding of its place in the universe. This knowledge was not stored in any external medium. It lived entirely in the memories of living people, passed from generation to generation through the deliberate, careful, repetitive acts of storytelling, singing, ceremony, and demonstration that formed the core of education in every hunter-gatherer society ever studied. The depth and sophistication of this indigenous knowledge is perhaps the most persistently underestimated feature of prehistoric human life. When we say that our ancestors were intelligent, we do not mean intelligent in some abstract potential sense. We mean intelligent in the most practically demonstrated way possible. They were people who had solved, repeatedly and reliably, the problem of surviving in environments that would rapidly kill most modern humans who were dropped into them without technological support. That is not primitive. That is expertise of the highest order. Chapter 3. The First Artists. 36,000 years on the walls. Imagine following a narrow passage deep into the earth. The ceiling drops low in places, requiring you to crawl. The air is cool and still, carrying a mineral smell, ancient and clean. Your light is a small stone lamp burning animal fat, its flame casting a wavering orange glow that illuminates perhaps 2 feet in any direction before the darkness swallows everything again. You move further in. The passage opens. You raise your lamp, and the walls come alive. Horses stretch across the stone in herds of a dozen, their manes suggested by a few careful lines, their legs blurred with motion. A pride of lions, not a single dominant animal, but 8, 10, 12 individuals, moves with the fluid purposefulness of a real hunt. Woolly rhinoceroses lower their massive heads in a posture of threat. Cave bears rear up against a rocky overhang. Overhead, on the ceiling, 2 bison lock horns in a struggle that seems to shake the cave walls. Everything moves. Everything breathes. The animals are rendered with a confidence and fluency of line that speaks of practiced mastery, of an eye trained to observe carefully and a hand trained to translate that observation into image. You are standing inside the Chauvet Cave, in what is now southern France, and every creature on these walls was painted approximately 36,000 years ago. Let that number settle. 36,000 years. The oldest confirmed paintings at the Chauvet Cave predate the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza by more than 30,000 years. They were already ancient beyond imagining when the first dynasties of Egypt were being established. The artists who made them are separated from the moment you are standing in by a gulf of time so vast that our verbal descriptions of it can barely capture its true scale. And yet, the art itself does not feel ancient. It does not feel primitive or tentative or groping. It feels accomplished. It feels intentional. When you look at the lions of Chauvet, you are looking at work that would be recognized as skilled by any art critic in the world, stripped of its context and date. The understanding of animal form and movement, the command of line and silhouette, the sophisticated use of the cave's own surface as an element of the composition. These are the marks of mastery, not of beginner. This is one of the most surprising and affecting facts about human prehistory. Art did not begin poorly and gradually improve. It arrived, as far as the surviving evidence shows, already astonishingly good. The cave of Lascaux in southwestern France, whose galleries were discovered in 1940 when a teenager's dog fell into a shaft in the ground, contained some of the most celebrated prehistoric art ever found. Aurochs and horses and deer painted across the walls and ceilings of multiple connected chambers with a confidence and skill that stunned the academic world when the site was first studied in the mid-20th century. Lascaux is only 17,000 years old, making it younger than Chauvet by nearly 20 millennia. And yet the two sites share a remarkable stylistic sophistication that runs counter to any simple narrative of gradual artistic progress. At Altamira in northern Spain, the great ceiling of what archaeologists call the chamber of the polychrome animals presents bison after bison, each one uniquely rendered, each one capturing a different aspect of that animal's physical presence and behavioral posture. Some lie curled as if resting, others stand alert, heads raised, nostrils testing the wind. One appears to have just risen from lying down, its body in the awkward intermediate posture of an animal mid-movement. The artist, and there may have been several, working over an extended period, understood bison anatomy so well that the paintings contain accurate details of muscle structure that would not be formally described by European naturalists until the 19th century. What made these paintings possible was not just artistic talent, though that was clearly present in abundance. It was sustained, careful, intimate observation of the natural world. Prehistoric artists lived with wild animals in a way that no modern human does. They watched them for hours every day. They hunted them, which requires understanding their behavior at a level of detail that goes far beyond casual acquaintance. They probably studied them the way a modern field biologist might study a research subject, noting every variation in posture and expression and movement, building over years an internal visual library of extraordinary richness. The paintings are the external expression of that internal library, but creating them was not a simple matter of observing, then painting. These were technically demanding works requiring careful preparation. Pigments had to be gathered, iron oxides for reds and yellows, manganese and charcoal for blacks, and ground to fine powder using stone implements, then mixed with binding agents, possibly animal fat or plant materials or blood or saliva, to produce paints of precisely the right consistency for the surface being worked. In some caves, analysis has revealed the use of multiple pigment layers, suggesting that artists were mixing colors with considerable intentionality. The deep interior of the Chauvet cave was reached by navigating several hundred meters of passage, which means that every material used to create the paintings had to be carried in. Pigments, lamps, lamp fuel, perhaps scaffolding made from wood to reach the higher surfaces. At several sites, evidence of wooden scaffolding has been found or inferred from the location of the paintings. The great aurochs bulls at Lascaux's Hall of the Bulls are painted on a curved ceiling nearly 3 meters high. Reaching that surface with enough stability to execute controlled brushwork required a platform. Someone planned, gathered materials for, and constructed that platform, then used it to paint images that the typical viewer on the ground below could not comfortably examine. The painting was not made for easy viewing. It was made to exist, to be there, whether or not anyone stood beneath it. The question that has occupied generations of researchers is simply this: why? What was the purpose of all this extraordinary effort expended in the permanent darkness of deep cave chambers that most people would never enter? The most enduring answer is ritual, that these spaces functioned as sacred sites where ceremonial activities of some kind were performed, and that the paintings were part of those ceremonies. Evidence in support of this interpretation includes the observation that many of the most elaborately painted chambers are deep in the cave systems, requiring considerable effort and some danger to reach. They are not locations you would go simply to make decorative images for casual admiration. They are places you would go for a specific purpose, with specific intent. The acoustic properties of certain painted chambers have attracted significant attention from researchers interested in the relationship between art and sound. In multiple cave systems, the most densely painted walls turn out to correspond with locations that have unusually strong acoustic properties. Resonant chambers where voices or percussion create striking echoes or reverberation effects. This may be coincidence, or it may reflect a deliberate understanding on the part of the cave's users that certain locations within the cave had special sonic qualities that made them appropriate for ritual activities involving music or chanting. Some researchers have proposed that the caves served as spaces for shamanic practices, altered state experiences in which practitioners believed themselves to be traveling between the ordinary world and a spiritual realm, bringing back knowledge or power for the benefit of their communities. This interpretation is supported by the presence in cave art worldwide of ambiguous figures that combine human and animal characteristics, partial human bodies with animal heads, or figures and postures suggesting trance states, or combinations of features drawn from multiple species. These hybrid beings appear in the art of Southern Africa and Australia and the Americas, as well as in European cave art, which has led some researchers to propose that they reflect a genuinely widespread set of beliefs and practices related to shamanic traditions. But perhaps the most emotionally immediate feature of prehistoric cave art is one that requires no elaborate theoretical framework to understand: the handprints. At dozens of cave sites across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, ancient people left behind the stenciled outline of their hands. The technique was simple and universal. Press the hand flat against the cave wall, take a mouthful of pigment mixed with water or binding material, and blow it through pursed lips around the outline of the hand, leaving its negative impression on the stone. Lift the hand away. The shape remains. At the cave of El Castillo in northern Spain, some of these hand stencils have been dated to more than 40,000 years ago. At a cave in Sulawesi, Indonesia, hand stencils and animal paintings date to at least 44,000 years ago, at the time of their dating, the oldest confirmed figurative art in the world. Similar images appear in caves in Argentina and in open rock shelters across Australia and southern Africa. The specifics of culture and chronology vary enormously, but the gesture itself, the impulse that drove a person to place their hand against a wall and leave its trace behind, that is the same everywhere and always. It is the simplest possible statement of existence. I am here. I was here. This is my hand. I am a living being, and I want to leave some evidence of that. And they did. For tens of thousands of years, those hands have been waiting on those walls, patient as the stone itself. Long after the people who made them turned to dust, long after the communities they belonged to dissolved and scattered and were absorbed into other lineages, the hands remain. And if you stand before one of them and place your own hand carefully over the ancient outline, fingers aligned with fingers, your palm covering the faint shadow of a palm pressed against this same stone 50,000 years ago, something happens that is difficult to articulate, but impossible to dismiss. The distance collapses. The immensity of the time that separates you from that moment remains, objectively, unchanged. 50,000 years is still 50,000 years, but the sense of that time as an unbridgeable gulf, as a wall between you and those ancient lives, that dissolves. Because the person who stood here was not thinking in geological time when they pressed their hand to this wall. They were doing something immediate and personal. They were saying something to whoever might come after. And now, you have come after, and the message has been received. That communication, across the widest gulf of time a human being can directly experience, may be the most extraordinary achievement of prehistoric art. Not the technical skill, as remarkable as it is, not the aesthetic power, which is genuine and profound, but the simple fact of it. A person who lived before any civilization that we know of had the impulse to leave a mark, and the mark survived. And here you are receiving it. They were here. They existed. They mattered. And in some sense that resists easy analysis. The proof is still on the walls. Chapter 4. Surviving the freeze, human life in the Ice Age. 20,000 years ago, the planet was a different world. A walker traveling north from central France would have encountered the edge of a permanent ice sheet not far north of where Paris stands today. That ice sheet, in some places a kilometer or more thick, extended across what is now Great Britain, across Scandinavia, across most of the northern parts of North America and Asia. So much of the Earth's water was locked into glacial ice that global sea levels stood nearly 120 meters lower than they do today, exposing vast stretches of continental shelf that are now submerged beneath shallow seas. Britain was attached to continental Europe by a broad land plain. Australia and New Guinea were connected. The islands of Southeast Asia were joined into a single great peninsula. The geography of the world was genuinely different from the map we know. This was the last glacial maximum, the most intense cold phase of the most recent ice age, a period of extreme cold and aridity that tested the resilience of every species living through it and eliminated many. Globally, temperatures were several degrees colder than today. Vegetation zones had shifted dramatically southward. Many of the landscapes that are now temperate forest or productive farmland were then either covered by ice or occupied by the cold, windswept grasslands and scrublands that ecologists call periglacial steppe. Vast open environments where the wind rarely stopped and winter temperatures could drop to extremes that would be considered dangerous even by modern polar standards. And your ancestors were living in it. Not just surviving at its edges, finding refuge in isolated pockets of mild climate, but actively inhabiting some of the coldest and most challenging landscapes on the planet. Following herds of mammoth and woolly rhinoceros and cave lion across frozen plains, making their homes in environments that, without shelter and appropriate clothing and fire management, could kill an unprotected human being within hours. How did they do it? The answer begins with clothing, and the story of Ice Age clothing is a story about a kind of engineering that tends to get overlooked because the materials involved are biological rather than industrial. The same basic principles that make modern high-performance cold weather gear effective, layering systems, wind resistance, moisture management, insulation, were understood and applied by Ice Age humans working exclusively with animal skins, plant fibers, and bone needles, with no metals, no synthetic materials, no industrial processes of any kind. The evidence for sophisticated Ice Age tailoring comes from those bone needles, objects recovered from sites across Europe and Asia that are among the most elegant small tools produced by any human culture. These needles are not crude awls for punching holes in leather. They are true needles, slender, carefully shaped, with precisely placed eyes through which thread, made from sinew or plant fiber, depending on what was locally available, could be passed. They are objects that could only be made by someone who had a detailed understanding of exactly what a needle needed to do and the skill to shape bone to meet those specifications. With these tools, Ice Age tailors made fitted, multi-layer garments that fit their wearers' bodies and trapped insulating air close to the skin. This specific reconstruction of Ice Age clothing is necessarily speculative, since organic materials almost never survive the tens of thousands of years between then and now. But evidence from comparable contemporary cultures working in comparable environments, combined with the analysis of Ice Age figurines and the distribution of bone needle types, allows researchers to propose that our ancestors were producing garments of considerable sophistication, not simply wrapped skins, but stitched and fitted pieces designed to manage heat retention and moisture as effectively as the available materials allowed. The shelter challenge in the open, largely treeless landscapes of Ice Age Europe and Central Asia, was solved with an ingenuity that remains striking even by modern standards. Without timber for substantial construction, the builders of the Ice Age used what was abundantly available: bones. The remains of mammoths, which were hunted systematically across a wide range of Ice Age landscapes, provided building material on a scale that allowed the construction of surprisingly large and durable structures. At several sites in what is now Ukraine and the Czech Republic, the remains of circular structures built from mammoth bones have been excavated in considerable detail. The foundations of these dwellings are formed by arrangements of mammoth skulls and lower jaw bones, which provide a stable base for the superstructure. Long bones, femurs, humeri, tusks are arranged to create dome-shaped or conical frames, which would then have been covered with hides and possibly sawed for insulation. Some of these structures were quite large, with floor areas exceeding 30 square meters. They contained central hearths surrounded by evidence of sustained occupation, food remains, tool manufacturing debris, the accumulated material of daily life over months or years. One site in Ukraine, known as Medzirish, was occupied approximately 15,000 years ago and shows clear evidence of long-term use. Analysis of the mammoths represented in the bone construction at Medzirish indicates that the bones came from at least 149 individual animals. This is not a single-season hunting cache. It represents an accumulation of materials over a substantial period of time, at a location apparently revisited by groups who maintained it and expanded it across generations. This was a settled community, or something close to it, operating in one of the coldest inhabited environments on Earth. The management of fire in these conditions was itself a sophisticated technology requiring knowledge that went well beyond simply knowing how to start a fire. In environments where wood was scarce, Ice Age people burned bone as fuel, a material that requires more effort to ignite than wood, but that burns hot enough, once established, to provide effective heat. They constructed hearths with stone linings that maximized heat radiation into the living space while containing the fire safely. They managed ventilation to prevent dangerous accumulations of smoke while preserving warmth, a balance that anyone who has spent time in a tightly enclosed space with a fire will understand is not trivially easy to achieve. The fauna of the Ice Age itself was extraordinary. The megafauna that lived alongside our ancestors during this period are familiar from museum displays and popular reconstructions: the woolly mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, the giant cave bear, the cave lion, the Irish elk with its enormous spreading antlers, the aurochs, the wild ancestor of domestic cattle, the steppe bison, the horse. These animals were not simply dramatic additions to the landscape. They were central to the economy, the culture, and the worldview of the people who lived among them. Hunting these animals, particularly the largest species, which could weigh several tons and were equipped with formidable natural defenses, required everything that distinguished human hunters from the other predators sharing the landscape with them: intelligence, planning, cooperation, tool technology, accumulated ecological knowledge, and a willingness to accept risk in pursuit of a potentially enormous reward. A single adult mammoth, successfully killed and processed, represented a quantity of food, fat, hide, bone, and sinew that could sustain a group of 20 people for several weeks. The strategies used to hunt Ice Age megafauna are a matter of ongoing archaeological investigation, but several approaches are well supported by the evidence. Driving animals toward natural features, cliffs, ravines, boggy ground, frozen lake ice, appears to have been used at multiple sites, with concentrations of butchered animal remains at locations where terrain would have made escape difficult. Ambush hunting, exploiting detailed knowledge of animal movement patterns to position hunters at predictable bottlenecks along migration routes, was probably widespread. And there is evidence for the use of long-distance projectile technology, spear throwers, known as atlatls, that could launch a spear with enough velocity and accuracy to penetrate the thick hide and deep fat reserves of a large animal from a safer distance than a hand-thrown spear could achieve. The Ice Age also shaped the genetic makeup of our species in ways that are still detectable in living populations. During periods of maximum glaciation, when vast areas became uninhabitable even for well-adapted human populations, people were forced to retreat to the limited habitable regions known as glacial refugia, places where the combination of latitude, proximity to the ocean, and local topography produced climates mild enough to support human survival. These refugia became population centers where genetic diversity was preserved, and from which populations expanded again when climates improved. In Europe, the primary refugia appear to have been in the Iberian Peninsula, in southern France, and in the region north of the Black Sea. When the ice retreated and habitable land expanded, populations from these refugia spread north and east, repopulating vast territories that had been essentially uninhabitable during the glacial maximum. The genetic patterns left by these expansions and contractions are still visible in the DNA of modern Europeans, a palimpsest of migrations written in the molecular record. The end of the Ice Age, which began around 15,000 years ago and was essentially complete by about 10,000 years ago, was not a gradual, uniform process. It involved periods of rapid warming interspersed with sudden reversals, periods when temperatures plunged again and ice sheets temporarily re-advanced before the underlying warming trend reasserted itself. The most dramatic of these reversals, known as the Younger Dryas, occurred roughly 12,900 years ago and saw temperatures in the North Atlantic region drop by as much as 10 degrees Celsius within a few decades, a pace of change that would have been perceptible within a single human lifetime. These rapid climate oscillations posed immense challenges for the human populations living through them. Ecosystems shifted dramatically, forcing both animals and the people who depended on them to move, adapt, or perish. The megafauna of the Ice Age, the mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses and cave bears and giant deer, progressively disappeared during and after this period of climate change, driven to extinction by the combination of warming climates that destroyed their habitat and the relentless pressure of human hunting that had been increasing for thousands of years. By 10,000 years ago, most of the great Ice Age megafauna were gone. The world was warming, greening, becoming recognizable in its broad outlines as the world we know today. And the humans who had survived the Ice Age, who had spent tens of thousands of years perfecting the art of living in extreme conditions, were about to face the most profound transformation in all of human prehistory. A change so fundamental that it would alter the species more dramatically than any climate event. A change that began so quietly, so gradually, that the people living through it probably had no awareness that anything fundamental was changing at all. Chapter 5. Walking out of Eden, the greatest migration in human history. There is a place in what is now the Arabian Peninsula where, 60,000 years ago, a coastline met a sea. The exact location is now submerged, part of the seafloor of the Persian Gulf or the Gulf of Aden. Geography transformed by the 10,000-year rise in sea levels that accompanied the end of the Ice Age. But at that moment, 60,000 years ago, a person stood at that shoreline and faced a choice that, while they could not have known it, would change the course of all subsequent history. Behind them, everything their species had ever known. The continent where human beings had evolved, where every human being who had ever lived had lived. A landscape as familiar as breathing. Before them, the rest of the world. This was not the first time a human being had stood at the boundary of Africa and faced the unknown beyond. Earlier migrations had carried populations of archaic humans, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, the ancestors of the Neanderthals and Denisovans, out of Africa and across much of the Old World long before modern humans arrived. But those earlier migrations had not led to the colonization of the entire planet. They had led to populations adapted to specific regions, isolated from one another by geography, evolving along their own separate paths. The migration that began somewhere on the African coastline 60,000 years ago was different. The people who made it, or more accurately, the populations whose descendants gradually diffused outward over the centuries and millennia that followed, carried with them all the behavioral and cognitive capacities that had been developing through hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution in Africa, and whatever combination of qualities had been assembled in those people, it was enough to do something no previous human migration had achieved. Not just to populate one new region or several, but to expand continuously until there were essentially no habitable territories on the planet left to reach. The initial route appears to have been coastal, following the shoreline of the Arabian Peninsula and then the coast of South and Southeast Asia. These first modern migrants moved through environments that, while new to them, provided familiar resources. Coastlines everywhere offer the same basic toolkit for subsistence: shellfish and crustaceans, fish in shallow waters, seabirds and their eggs, marine mammals seasonally accessible at haul-out sites, and the seaweed and coastal plants that supplement a diet of animal protein. A coastal lifestyle required adapting to specific local species and conditions, but the underlying ecological strategy was transferable. The same approach to resource extraction that had worked on an African beach would work, with appropriate modifications, on a beach in Arabia or India or Southeast Asia. The first great milestone of this expansion was the colonization of Australia, and it represents one of the most intellectually satisfying mysteries in the entire field of human prehistory. At the time of the earliest known human presence in Australia, dated by multiple lines of evidence to at least 65,000 years ago, and possibly earlier, the continent was not connected to the Southeast Asian mainland. Even accounting for the lower sea levels of the Ice Age, which reduced the water barriers that needed to be crossed, reaching Australia required a series of open ocean crossings across stretches of water that would have been visible across the entire horizon. You would have needed to set out from a shore into open sea without being able to see your destination, navigate across water to an intermediate island, and then set out again into open water before finally reaching the Australian landmass. This is not a journey that happens by accident. It requires deliberate decision, planning, the construction or acquisition of watercraft capable of carrying people and their supplies across open water, and the navigational knowledge to maintain direction across a sea surface with no landmarks visible. The people who made this crossing, the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians, were not stumbling blindly into a new world. They were exploring it intentionally. Once established in Australia, these initial colonists proceeded over the following tens of thousands of years to spread across the entire continent, adapting to environments as different from one another as tropical rainforest and burning desert, developing technologies and knowledge systems specific to each region's particular challenges and resources, and ultimately producing the most sustained continuous cultural traditions that archaeology has documented anywhere in the world. Aboriginal Australian cultures, when the first European contact was made in the 18th century, were practicing land management techniques, maintaining oral traditions, and observing astronomical and ecological knowledge that traced in some respects to the earliest periods of Australian human occupation. Meanwhile, the broader migration out of Africa was continuing on multiple fronts. Some populations moved north and west, eventually reaching the Middle East, and from there spreading into Europe and Central Asia. In Europe, they encountered the Neanderthal populations that had occupied the continent for hundreds of thousands of years. Exactly how this encounter unfolded is a question that archaeologists continue to debate actively. But the outcome is clear. Within several thousand years of modern humans' arrival in Europe, the Neanderthal populations of that continent had disappeared. The genetic evidence establishes that there was interbreeding, that modern Europeans carry a small but detectable percentage of Neanderthal ancestry. But the Neanderthals themselves, as a distinct biological and cultural entity, ceased to exist. The occupation of Europe by modern humans was accompanied by the cultural flourishing that produced the great cave paintings already explored in our previous chapter. The period between 40,000 and 10,000 years ago in Europe is sometimes called the Upper Paleolithic, and in terms of the density and elaborateness of the cultural record it represents, it stands apart from what came before, a period of what appears to be genuinely accelerating cultural innovation, with new tool types appearing and spreading rapidly, new artistic traditions emerging, long-distance trade networks developing in ways that connected communities hundreds of miles apart. East and north, other population branches were pushing into the vast interior of Asia, eventually reaching the extreme eastern and northeastern margins of the continent, the lands that are now Siberia, Kamchatka, and eventually the areas bordering the Bering Land Bridge that, during periods of low sea level, connected Asia and North America. The colonization of Siberia by modern humans is in some respects as impressive a feat as the colonization of Australia. This is some of the coldest inhabited landscape on Earth, and doing so required the full range of cold weather adaptations, tailored clothing, engineered shelter, specialized hunting technologies that had been developed over the preceding tens of thousands of years. The peopling of the Americas remains one of the most active and contentious areas of debate in all of human prehistory. The traditional model, which dominated archaeological thinking for much of the 20th century, held that the first Americans crossed from Siberia to Alaska via the Bering Land Bridge approximately 13,000 years ago, then spread southward through an ice-free corridor between the great ice sheets of that period, reaching South America within a few thousand years. The descendants of these first arrivals, in this model, were the people who made the distinctive stone tools known as Clovis points, elegant bifacially flaked spear tips that appear suddenly and widely across North America beginning around 13,300 years ago. The Clovis first model has been significantly complicated, if not altogether overturned, by discoveries made over the past several decades. Sites in both North and South America have produced evidence of human presence significantly older than the Clovis horizon, in some cases by several thousand years. The Monteverde site in southern Chile, dated to approximately 14,600 years ago, is perhaps the best documented of these, and its age has been accepted by the broad consensus of the archaeological community. Getting to southern Chile by 14,500 years ago would have required crossing the Bering Land Bridge and then moving extremely rapidly through the length of the Americas, rapidly enough that many researchers now favor a coastal route, with initial colonists moving along the Pacific coast in watercraft and colonizing coastal and near-coastal environments before gradually dispersing into the continental interior. Whatever the exact sequence of events, and it was almost certainly more complex than any single model captures, what is certain is that within a relatively brief period of geological time, human beings spread from their point of entry in the far northwest of North America to the very tip of South America, covering approximately 15,000 kilometers and adapting to every type of environment the Western Hemisphere had to offer. They hunted the megafauna of the Americas: mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, giant beavers, American horses, camels, adapting and refining hunting strategies developed by their ancestors for different prey on different continents. They learned new plant foods, new terrain features, new weather patterns, new dangers and opportunities, all within the span of a few thousand years. By roughly 1,500 years ago, the only large habitable territories on Earth that had not yet been reached by human beings were the remote islands of eastern Polynesia, Hawaii, New Zealand, Easter Island, and the smaller islands of the Central Pacific. These were colonized in the remarkable maritime expansion known as the Polynesian voyaging tradition, in which populations originating in the Western Pacific built and navigated double-hulled sailing canoes across thousands of kilometers of open ocean, using sophisticated traditional navigation. Techniques that encoded knowledge of stars, swells, currents, winds, and bird behavior in oral traditions passed between generations of master navigators. New Zealand was reached approximately 700 to 800 years ago, making it one of the last major landmasses to be inhabited by humans. The Maori people who arrived there were the final pioneers of the great human migration that had begun 60,000 years earlier on a coastline in eastern Africa. Every person alive today is a descendant of the people who made those journeys. Every family tree, traced back far enough, leads to the people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge, or paddled to Australia, or navigated the open Pacific. We are all, without exception, the children of explorers. The impulse that drove those journeys, the restless curiosity, the willingness to set out into the unknown, the confidence that what lay beyond the horizon could be understood and navigated, that impulse is not just history. It is inheritance. It is part of who we are. Chapter 6: The Spirit World: Belief, Ritual, and the Birth of Meaning. 100,000 years ago, someone brought flowers to a grave. This detail, recovered not from written records, which did not yet exist, but from the preserved pollen of specific plant species found in careful arrangement within the burial soil of a Neanderthal grave in what is now northern Iraq, has a quality of intimacy that can stop you completely if you let it. Not just the act of burial, though that itself represents a profound threshold in the history of consciousness, but the flowers, the deliberate selection of blooming plants, their careful placement around a body that would never know they were there. The understanding, implicit in that simple act, that the occasion deserved something more than practical necessity could provide. That beauty mattered here, in this place, at this moment of loss. When did human beings first begin to believe in something beyond what their eyes could see? When did the first person look up at the night sky and wonder, not just what those bright points were, but what they meant? When did death first become more than the end of a body's function and become, instead, a threshold, a transition, a mystery demanding acknowledgement and response? We cannot answer these questions with the precision we would like. The inner life leaves no direct fossil record. We can infer it from behavior, from the ochre in the graves, the flowers, the careful positioning of bodies, the objects placed alongside the dead. But inference is not knowledge. We are working at the edge of what the evidence can tell us, looking for the shadows of beliefs that existed only in minds that are now gone. What the evidence does tell us, taken together, is that the essential elements of spiritual and religious experience were present in our ancestors long before the first civilization was built, long before the first temple, the first priest, the first written prayer, long before the word religion existed in any language. The fundamental human experience of confronting mortality, of seeking meaning in the face of loss, of imagining something beyond what the ordinary senses can access. These appear to have been part of the human experience from a very early stage, possibly from before the emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. The use of red ochre in burial contexts appears across an enormous span of time and space. At sites in South Africa, ochre processing activities date to well over 100,000 years ago. Burials with ochre deposits appear at sites in the Middle East, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, essentially everywhere that early modern humans, and in some cases their Neanderthal cousins, buried their dead. The specific meaning of the ochre practice is not recoverable, but the consistency with which it appears across cultures separated by vast distances and long periods of time suggests that it carried real significance. It was not random decoration. It was something more. Grave goods, objects placed with the dead, tell a similarly consistent and poignant story. Hunting tools arranged near a body in a position suggesting they were intended for use. Food placed alongside the deceased, as if for a journey. Ornaments, shell beads, animal teeth, carved pendants, arranged as if still worn. These acts assume that something persists after death, that the person who has died will continue in some form, in some place, and will need what the living need. Placing a tool in a grave is an act of generosity toward someone who is gone, but who, in the imagination of those left behind, is not fully absent. The cosmological frameworks within which these burial practices made sense were, in their broad structure, remarkably consistent across the widely separated hunter-gatherer cultures that archaeologists and anthropologists have studied. The concept that the world is thoroughly alive, that every significant feature of the landscape, every animal species, every weather phenomenon, every celestial body, is not merely an object, but an entity with its own consciousness and its own form of agency, appears to be the deepest and most widespread of all human religious intuitions. Anthropologists call this worldview animism, and it appears in some form in virtually every human culture that existed before the rise of the major world religions of the last few thousand years. In an animistic world, the relationship between human beings and the rest of existence is not one of subject to object. It is one of person to person, or perhaps being to being. The deer that approaches the hunter is not simply a prey animal exploiting available food resources. It is an intentional agent, a being with its own relationships and its own form of awareness, making a choice, in the hunter's understanding, to offer itself. The river that floods is not merely responding to upstream rainfall. It is expressing something, communicating something, perhaps reacting to human behavior in ways that the community's relationship with the river's spirit has failed to manage appropriately. The sudden illness of a child is not simply the result of contact with a pathogen. It is a sign that something in the web of relationships between the human community and the spiritual world has been disrupted and must be repaired. This way of understanding the world is not primitive confusion. It is a coherent and functionally effective framework for organizing experience and guiding behavior in environments where the connections between human actions and ecological consequences are intimate and immediate. If the river floods when the weather shifts, and the weather shifts when certain animals appear, or certain plants bloom, and the blooming of those plants follows patterns that can be observed and remembered and encoded in seasonal ritual, then the practical knowledge needed to navigate these relationships is not easily separable from the spiritual framework in which that knowledge is embedded. They grew up together, the practical and the sacred, and in the deep history of our species, they have never been fully distinct. The practitioners who specialized in navigating the boundary between the ordinary human world and the spirit world, the shamans, or their functional equivalents across hundreds of different cultural traditions, occupies some of the most important space in the archaeological record of prehistoric spirituality. Evidence for shamanic practices appears at sites spanning tens of thousands of years across multiple continents. The therianthropic figures, part human, part animal, that appear in cave art worldwide are among the most widely discussed examples. These hybrid beings, which combine human body elements with the heads, limbs, or other features of animals, are consistently interpreted as representing individuals in the process of transformation, crossing the boundary between human and animal consciousness, entering the animal's awareness, seeing the world through a different set of eyes. In many indigenous traditions, where shamanic practices are documented, this transformation is understood not as metaphor, but as literal reality. A skilled practitioner can, under the right conditions of trance or altered consciousness, genuinely enter a different experiential state in which the ordinary separation between human and animal awareness dissolves, and the practitioner accesses knowledge or power that ordinary waking consciousness cannot reach. Whether one understands this as a description of actual spiritual reality, or as an account of the psychological effects of certain neurological states, the fact of the practice's extreme antiquity and its appearance in cultures that had no conceivable contact with one another is remarkable. Among the most compelling physical evidence for organized ritual activity from the prehistoric period is a site that was, until very recently, the oldest known example of monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe, in what is now southeastern Turkey, was built approximately 11,600 years ago, several thousand years before the construction of Stonehenge, and nearly 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its T-shaped stone pillars, some of them standing more than 5 meters tall and weighing up to 10 tons, are arranged in circular enclosures decorated with detailed relief carvings of animals and abstract symbols. The sheer scale of the construction and the organizational complexity it implies was already astonishing when the site was first excavated. What makes Göbekli Tepe genuinely revolutionary in our understanding of prehistory is the identity of its builders. They were hunter-gatherers, not farmers, not the settled, surplus-producing agricultural communities that archaeologists had long assumed were prerequisite to the kind of organized, specialized labor that monumental construction requires. They were mobile foragers who obtained their food from wild plants and animals, and who, by the conventional model of cultural evolution, should not yet have been capable of the coordinated community projects that the site represents. Göbekli Tepe requires us to rethink the relationship between religion and civilization. The traditional model held that surplus agriculture led to settled communities, which led to social specialization and hierarchy, which made possible the religious institutions and monumental architecture of the early civilizations. Göbekli Tepe suggests a different sequence. Perhaps it was religion, the shared belief in something worth building for, that motivated the organizational effort that eventually made agriculture possible. Perhaps the sacred preceded the practical rather than following from it. Perhaps the first great human project was not growing food, but building a place to meet the gods. And what gods were these, exactly? What did the people who built Göbekli Tepe believe about the nature of reality? We do not know. We have the carvings, vultures with spread wings, scorpions, foxes, aurochs, wild boars, and enigmatic abstract forms that resist straightforward interpretation. We have the layout of the enclosures and the apparent evidence of seasonal gathering at the site. We have the traces of feasting, animal bones in quantities that suggest large communal meals. But we do not have the words. We do not have the stories that made the place make sense. This is perhaps the deepest form of loss that separates us from our prehistoric ancestors. Not the physical conditions of their lives, which archaeology can reconstruct in considerable detail. Not their bodies or their faces, which ancient DNA and skeletal analysis can approximate with increasing precision. But their inner world, the specific texture of what they believed, what they feared, what they hoped for, what they told themselves about the meaning of existence. That inner world is gone, unreachable, inaccessible to any instrument that science currently possesses. What remains is the evidence of what it produced, the care taken with graves, the flowers placed at the feet of the dead, the ochre scattered over bodies that would return to the earth, the hands pressed against cave walls in a gesture that says nothing and everything. I was here. I saw this world, and I found it worthy of acknowledgement. I felt something I could not name, and I tried, in the only way available to me, to make that feeling last. The belief in something beyond the merely material. The need to mark the transitions of existence with ritual and beauty. The impulse to leave traces of one's own awareness for those who come after. These are not modern inventions. They are as old as our species, possibly older. They are, perhaps, among the defining features of the kind of consciousness that we call human, and they were present in the world long before any of the institutional frameworks that we now identify with religion had come into existence. Before temples and priests and holy books, before doctrine and denomination, before any of the theological systems that structure the spiritual lives of billions of people today. They were just people sitting with the dead, watching the stars, wondering about the darkness and what it contained. And somewhere in that wondering, in that sitting with mystery rather than fleeing from it, something essential about human consciousness was being expressed and preserved. Chapter 7. The Technologies of Deep Time. Intelligence without instruction. Manuals. There is a moment that visitors to certain natural history museums sometimes experience when standing before a display of ancient stone tools. The objects themselves seem simple enough. Irregular chunks of flint or chert or obsidian, some with one or more edges flaked to sharpness, others shaped more systematically into recognizable forms. Hand axes, scrapers, blades. The labels on the cases give dates: 40,000 years, 80,000 years, 200,000 years ago. And the objects seem, from a distance, to be modest enough achievements. Then someone explains what it actually takes to make them. Flint knapping, the controlled removal of flakes from a stone core to produce a desired shape, is among the most difficult manual skills that human beings practice. Modern students learning the craft at the hands of skilled instructors typically work for months before they can reliably produce even a simple flake with consistent attributes. Producing a well-shaped, bifacially flaked point, a projectile tip with precisely controlled symmetry, thickness, and edge geometry, requires years of practice and a degree of spatial understanding and fine motor control that most people who attempt it never fully develop. The people who made the tools in those museum cases were not beginners. The sophistication of Paleolithic stone tool manufacture is most apparent not in any single spectacular example, but in the consistency and standardization visible across large samples of tools from the same tradition. When the same tool type appears repeatedly, with consistent proportions and carefully controlled attributes, across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers and thousands of years, it is evidence of a technical tradition carefully transmitted through teaching and apprenticeship across generations. Someone was training younger craftspeople. Someone was setting and maintaining standards. The technology had a social infrastructure. Different stone materials have different properties and require different handling, different striking angles, different force levels, different preparatory shaping of the core before production can begin. Expert knappers knew these properties the way a woodworker knows the grain of different timbers. Certain stones were preferred for specific tasks precisely because of these properties, which is why prehistoric people would transport specific stone types for hundreds of kilometers, passing by equally usable but less suitable materials to obtain the exact stone they wanted for a particular application. This is not behavior driven by instinct. It is informed choice based on accumulated technical knowledge. The Levallois technique, developed around 300,000 years ago in Africa and later adopted widely across Eurasia, exemplifies the depth of planning involved in advanced Paleolithic tool production. In this technique, the knapper begins not by making a tool, but by carefully preparing a stone core, shaping it through a series of controlled removals into a specific dome-like form. Only then is a single, carefully aimed strike used to detach a large, preformed flake of exactly the intended shape from the prepared core. The final tool is produced by a process that begins many steps before the tool itself exists, requiring the knapper to plan ahead, to anticipate the outcome of each preparatory strike, and to work toward a mental image of the finished product that guides every decision along the way. This is exactly the kind of multi-step forward planning that cognitive scientists associate with sophisticated executive function. The capacity to hold a goal in mind and subordinate current actions to the achievement of that future outcome. It requires working memory, sequencing ability, and an understanding of cause and effect relationships that extends over time. These are not simple behaviors. They are indicators of cognitive complexity. Beyond stone, prehistoric technology encompassed an enormous range of materials and methods, most of which leave little or no archaeological trace. The challenge in understanding the full scope of prehistoric technological achievement is precisely the challenge that the oldest human story poses everywhere. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Wood does not survive tens of thousands of years except under extraordinary preservation conditions. Plant fiber, leather, sinew, gut, all the organic materials that form the basis of most practical technology in the prehistoric world decompose completely under normal conditions, leaving no trace of the objects they were used to make. What we know of wooden technology from the period before widespread organic preservation comes almost entirely from exceptional sites. A series of wooden spears found at a site called Schöningen in Germany, dated to approximately 300,000 years ago, are among the most important of these. 8 throwing spears, each between 1.8 and 2.5 meters long, were recovered in nearly complete condition, preserved by waterlogged anaerobic conditions that prevented decay. They are carefully made, tapered toward both ends, with a center of gravity positioned for optimal throwing dynamics, shaped from the hardest part of the wood, the base of the trunk of spruce trees. They are balanced and weighted in the way a modern javelin designer would balance and weight a throwing weapon. They are, in every meaningful technical sense, highly engineered implements. Plant-based technologies were equally sophisticated, though almost entirely lost. We know from preserved examples at certain waterlogged or dry cave sites that prehistoric people were making baskets, nets, cordage, and woven textiles from plant materials long before the agricultural period. The oldest known textile fragment dates to approximately 27,000 years ago from a site in the Czech Republic. The oldest known fish nets, found in Finland, are approximately 10,000 years old. But these objects preserve only when conditions are exceptional. For every preserved example, there were surely thousands that vanished without trace, carrying with them evidence of technical traditions that we will never recover. The medical and pharmaceutical knowledge of prehistoric people represents perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of prehistoric technological achievement. Without written records, the extent of this knowledge is very difficult to assess, but several lines of evidence suggest it was substantial. Chemical analysis of the dental calculus, hardened plaque, of prehistoric individuals has detected traces of specific plant compounds, including some with demonstrable pharmaceutical properties, consumed in contexts that appear to have been medicinal rather than dietary. Archaeological sites at locations far from the natural range of certain plant species suggest that specific medicinal plants were being transported over long distances. implying awareness of their particular properties and deliberate acquisition for specific purposes. Contemporary hunter-gatherer pharmacopoeias, documented before the disruption of indigenous knowledge traditions, are astonishingly extensive. A healer in certain Amazonian traditions may know the specific uses, preparation methods, dosages, and contraindications of several hundred plant species. A traditional healer in sub-Saharan Africa may maintain an active pharmacopoeia of comparable depth. These knowledge systems represent the cumulative product of generations of observation, experimentation, and careful transmission. They did not develop overnight. They developed over the same long timescales that shaped everything else about human culture and knowledge. Thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands, of careful empirical investigation conducted without laboratories, without instruments, without peer review, but with the full engagement of human intelligence and the powerful motivation of having no alternatives. The navigation of oceanic voyages, already touched upon in our chapter on human migration, represents another domain of prehistoric technological achievement that tends to be drastically underestimated. The Polynesian navigational tradition, best documented among all prehistoric maritime traditions because it survived into the period of European contact, involved the memorization and application of an extraordinary complex of observational knowledge. Expert navigators committed to memory the rising and setting points of dozens of stars, the particular swell patterns that characterized different regions of the Pacific, the way clouds form over islands not yet visible above the horizon, the behavior of specific bird species at different distances from land, and the subtle color changes in the water that indicate proximity to shallow areas. This knowledge was organized into a coherent navigational system capable of guiding a double-hulled canoe across 4,000 kilometers of open ocean to an island a few kilometers wide. The deep origins of this tradition extend far back before the period of Polynesian expansion, back to the maritime cultures of ancient Southeast Asia and Melanesia, whose own voyaging traditions were the foundation on which Polynesian navigation was built. And those earlier traditions themselves had roots in the still older maritime capabilities that had made the colonization of Australia and New Guinea possible 65,000 years ago. The thread of maritime technological knowledge runs from the earliest ocean crossings in human prehistory to the great voyaging canoes of Polynesia, an unbroken tradition of accumulated understanding about the relationship between human beings and the sea. All of this technology, the stone tools and the wooden spears, the bone needles and the tailored garments, the plant medicines and the navigational star knowledge, has in common the essential characteristic that it existed primarily in minds rather than in objects. The tools were made by people who knew how to make them, and that knowledge resided in the person, not in any external record or document. It was transmitted personally through apprenticeship and observation and practice, and the corrections of more experienced practitioners. It was social knowledge, maintained by communities rather than individuals, and vulnerable to disruption in ways that written knowledge is not. Every time a band was decimated by disease or climate disaster, a portion of the accumulated technological knowledge of the human species was at risk. Every time the last elder who knew how to prepare a particular medicinal plant died without having transmitted that knowledge. A discovery perhaps thousands of years in the making was lost. Every time a maritime tradition was disrupted before its knowledge could be passed to the next generation, a navigational understanding built up over centuries vanished into the silence. How much of what our prehistoric ancestors knew has been lost? The honest answer is that we cannot know, because we do not know what we do not know. We can see the fragments that survived, the stone tools, the exceptional organic preservations, the ethnographic records of indigenous traditions captured before their disruption. But the shadow of what is missing is vast and dark, and any account of prehistoric human achievement is necessarily incomplete in ways that cannot be fully specified. What we can say is that the picture that emerges from all the available evidence is not the picture of primitive struggle that the popular imagination provides. It is a picture of people who were deeply intelligent, comprehensively knowledgeable within their domains, technically skilled, and systematically organized for the transmission of complex knowledge across generations. People who had solved repeatedly and reliably some of the most difficult problems that the natural world can pose to a species trying to survive within it. People who were, in every meaningful sense, already fully human, and whose humanity expressed itself in the full range of forms that the human capacity for intelligence and creativity and knowledge can take. Chapter 8. The Slow Revolution. When humans became farmers, for 9/10 of human existence, no one had ever planted a seed deliberately. That sentence, taken slowly, reveals something profound about the scale of what happened between 10,000 years ago and now. The overwhelming majority of the time that our species has existed on this planet, the specific relationship between human beings and the landscape that eventually produced civilization, the deliberate cultivation of plants, the systematic management of animal herds, the construction of permanent settlement, did not exist. It was not a delayed discovery, waiting for sufficiently intelligent minds to arrive at it. It was not an idea that simply had not occurred to anyone. Hunter-gatherers understood plants intimately. They observed year after year how seeds fell, germinated, and grew. Some of them almost certainly practiced proto-agricultural behaviors, deliberately replanting roots or bulbs near camp, burning areas of vegetation to encourage the growth of favored food species, protecting fruiting trees from competing vegetation. They knew, at some level, how plant reproduction worked. And yet, for hundreds of thousands of years, none of this knowledge tipped into the systematic domestication and cultivation of crops. Why? And then why, around 12,000 years ago, did it begin to happen? Not just in one place, but in multiple places around the world, within a few thousand years of each other? These questions do not have simple answers, but exploring them honestly reveals something important about the nature of human adaptability and the contingency of what we call civilization. The period following the end of the last ice age, roughly between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago, saw a set of climatic and ecological changes that made the shift to agriculture both more possible and, in certain regions, more necessary. As the climate warmed and stabilized, certain landscapes became far more productive than they had been during the cold, dry conditions of the glacial period. In the region that stretches from the eastern Mediterranean coast through modern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, the area archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent. The warming climate produced an extraordinary abundance of wild cereals. Wheat and barley and rye grew densely on hillsides that had previously supported much sparser vegetation. Wild legumes, lentils, peas, chickpeas spread across lowland areas. Wild sheep and goats moved through this landscape in herds large enough to sustain year-round hunting. The hunter-gatherer populations of this region were doing very well. So well, in fact, that they began doing something unusual for a foraging society. They began to settle down. Sites like Ain Ghazal in Jordan and Moribet in northern Syria show evidence of semi-permanent or permanent settlement beginning well before the clear establishment of agriculture. Villages of substantial structures occupied year-round, with evidence of substantial food storage, large populations, and the social complexity that sustained cohabitation at that scale produces. This pre-agricultural settlement is significant because it represents a change in the relationship between people and place that set the conditions for the subsequent agricultural transition. When people are mobile, following seasonal resources across a broad territory, they cannot accumulate much. They cannot maintain large food stores because storing food requires either permanent structures or the logistical capacity to carry it, and neither is compatible with high mobility lifestyles. But when people begin to stay in one place, initially because resources are so abundant that moving is unnecessary, the calculus changes. Storing food becomes possible and then advantageous. Tending specific patches of productive vegetation rather than exploiting all vegetation equally across a wide area begins to make sense. The transition from broad-spectrum harvesting of wild plants to systematic cultivation of selected species was not a sudden event. It was a gradual process, playing out over hundreds of years or more, in which the proportion of food derived from managed plant sources gradually increased while the proportion from truly wild harvesting slowly decreased. The process of plant domestication itself, the genetic change from wild to domesticated plant, with its altered seed retention characteristics, modified germination timing, and other features that make cultivated varieties more useful to farmers than their wild progenitors, was an unintended consequence of the harvesting and planting practices of early proto-farmers. It was evolution driven by human behavior, not by any conscious selective program. By about 10,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent, the transition was essentially complete. Communities in this region were systematically cultivating domesticated forms of wheat, barley, lentils, peas, and flax. They were herding domesticated goats and sheep. They were living in substantial permanent villages of mud brick architecture. They were making pottery for the storage and cooking of food. They were practicing the full suite of behaviors that we recognize as Neolithic agriculture. But, and this is the part of the story that is rarely told with appropriate emphasis, the immediate consequences of this transition were not uniformly positive for the people who made it. The skeletal evidence from early agricultural communities tells a story of increased physical stress, nutritional compromise, and higher disease burden compared to their hunter-gatherer predecessors. average height decreased. Rates of tooth decay rose dramatically with the shift to a starchy cereal-based diet. Bone abnormalities associated with specific nutritional deficiencies appear more frequently. Evidence of repetitive strain injuries, the kind produced by hours of grain, grinding, digging, carrying heavy loads, increases substantially. Why would people adopt a way of life that, by many health-relevant measures, was worse than what they were replacing? The most widely accepted answer is population dynamics. Agriculture could support more people per unit of land than hunting and gathering. And in a world where reproductive success was the fundamental measure of any strategy's value, this meant that farming populations grew faster than foraging populations. Over time, this differential growth rate meant that farming communities expanded into territories previously occupied by foragers, not by conquest necessarily, but simply by being more numerous. The foragers, faced with the choice between adopting agriculture or retreating to less desirable territory, often ended up doing one or the other, or both, in sequence. From the perspective of any individual living through this transition, the trade-offs were probably not obvious. You worked harder, ate a less varied diet, lived in closer proximity to other people and to the animals you herded. You were more susceptible to the infectious diseases that spread rapidly in dense settlements. But you also lived in a permanent home, with more predictable food supply, with a larger community offering more potential partners and more protection from the kinds of acute crisis: a failed hunt, an injury at the wrong time that could be fatal to a small mobile band. Agriculture spread from its multiple centers of origin: the Fertile Crescent, China's Yellow River Valley, where rice and millet were domesticated independently, the highlands of New Guinea, taro and yam, the Mexican plateau, maize, beans and squash, the Andean foothills, potatoes and quinoa, the savannas of sub-Saharan Africa, sorghum and millet, through a combination of direct population movement and knowledge diffusion. Farmers moved into new territories, bringing their crops and animals with them. And neighboring foraging populations, exposed to agriculture, sometimes adopted it, partly or wholly, and became farmers themselves. The process was not uniform, and it was not irreversible. Archaeology records numerous cases of societies that adopted agriculture and then abandoned it, reverting to foraging lifestyles when conditions changed or when the advantages of agriculture diminished relative to its costs. The transition was a choice made repeatedly by many communities, each weighing their specific circumstances and options. It was not an inevitable march of progress, but a contingent development that happened to produce conditions capable of sustaining the social complexity that eventually produced cities, writing, and civilization. The first towns appeared in the Fertile Crescent around 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. Jericho, in the Jordan Valley, is among the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in the world, with evidence of substantial occupation by 9,000 years ago, including a massive stone tower and a surrounding stone wall, whose purpose has been debated for decades. By 8,000 years ago, Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia was supporting a community of several thousand people living in mud brick houses so closely packed that there were no streets between them. People accessed their homes through openings in the roofs and descended on ladders. These early communities were not yet cities in the full sense. They lacked the formal institutional structures. The centralized authority, the administrative bureaucracy, the specialized division of labor that characterize what archaeologists typically call urban civilization, but they were the immediate precursors of such structures. As population grew, and the logistical demands of managing agricultural production and food storage and community relations became more complex, new institutional forms emerged to handle them. Surplus food required management. Someone had to track how much grain was stored and who had contributed to the store. Someone had to mediate disputes over land boundaries and water rights. Someone had to organize the communal labor for irrigation projects, defensive walls, and ceremonial buildings. These organizational functions, initially performed by respected community members with no formal authority, gradually became institutionalized, transformed from roles anyone might fill into positions attached to specific individuals or families, backed by the community's productive capacity, and eventually by the threat of force. Hierarchy was not invented. It emerged, gradually and almost inevitably, from the structural conditions created by surplus agriculture, fixed settlement, and the growing complexity of large-scale community organization. And once it had emerged, it was self-reinforcing. Those who controlled the surplus controlled the labor of those who needed access to the surplus. Control of labor allowed the construction of monuments and the support of specialized craftspeople and warriors. Monuments and warriors consolidated power and made its inheritance possible. The first kings did not declare themselves kings. They were elders and headmen and priests whose practical authority over community resources gradually translated into something more permanent and more hereditary. The first armies were not standing forces of professional soldiers. They were the community's hunters and young men, organized first for raiding and defense, then for conquest. The first temples were not purpose-built religious institutions. They were the sacred meeting places of communities that had always had sacred meeting places, transformed by surplus and scale into something grander and more formalized. Writing appeared as a tool of administration, not literature. The earliest writing systems were not created to preserve myths or record history. They were created to keep track of goods. The oldest written records from Mesopotamia are inventories, lists of grain amounts, animal counts, labor obligations, trade transactions. The reed stylus was first put to clay in the service of accountancy, and only later became the instrument of epic poetry and theological treatise. With writing, the great transformation was complete. Everything that followed, the accumulation of recorded knowledge, the transmission of information across generations, without the constraints of individual memory. The possibility of building complex social institutions whose rules were written down, and therefore persistent beyond the lifetimes of their founders. Everything that we call civilization became possible once human knowledge could be stored in a medium that outlasted the people who possessed it. It had taken 300,000 years to get there. 300,000 years of surviving ice ages and near extinctions, of developing language and art and medicine and navigation and the 10,000 other skills that made human life possible in a world that cared nothing for human survival. 300,000 years of people raising children and burying their dead and telling stories and looking at the stars and wondering what it all meant. 300,000 years of being human in all the ways that matter, long before any of the institutions we identify with civilization existed. 5,000 years of written history. 295,000 years of everything that made it possible. Chapter 9. What they left in you, the deep past and the present moment. You are lying still in the dark, and your body is doing something extraordinary. Your heartbeat has slowed, your breathing has deepened, the muscles of your face and limbs have relaxed into the particular stillness that precedes sleep. Your nervous system is doing exactly what nervous systems evolved over millions of years to do at the end of a day, releasing its watchful tension, cycling from alertness to restoration, handing the body over to the processes of repair and consolidation that only proceed fully in sleep. None of this requires your conscious participation. It happens on its own, driven by biological systems so old that their basic architecture was established long before our species existed, long before any human being ever lay down to rest. The rhythms of sleep and waking, the chemistry of rest and arousal, the biological scheduling of appetite and energy and mood across the course of a day, these are ancient inheritances shaped by selection pressures that operated over timescales that dwarf the entire history of human civilization. You are a contemporary person with a Stone Age nervous system. This is not a criticism or a diagnosis. It is simply a fact about the relationship between biological evolution and cultural change, and understanding it has real consequences for how you make sense of your own inner life. No. 28. The human nervous system was shaped primarily by selection pressures that operated during the Pleistocene epoch, the geological period that corresponds, very roughly, to the span of human evolution. For most of that period, human beings lived in small social groups in environments where food availability was uncertain, where physical threats from predators and rival groups were real and immediate, where social belonging was not a comfort but a survival necessity, and where the kinds of chronic stressors that characterize modern life, financial anxiety, social comparison on a massive scale, information overload, sedentary indoor work, simply did not exist. The stress response, the cascade of hormonal and physiological changes that prepare the body for vigorous physical action in response to perceived threat, was shaped in an environment where stress was typically brief, intense, and followed by resolution.
You encountered a predator. Your stress hormones surged. You ran or fought or hid. The threat resolved one way or another. Your stress hormones subsided. You recovered. This system works beautifully for the kinds of threats it was designed to manage. It is less well adapted to the kinds of stressors that characterize contemporary life, where threats are often abstract, social, and chronic, where the thing making you anxious cannot be resolved by running away from it, and where the physiological state of alertness and readiness that the stress
response produces has no natural outlet and no natural endpoint. The modern human experience of chronic stress, of sustained low-level activation of the stress response without the acute danger that would justify it or the physical resolution that would discharge it, is in large part a mismatch between an ancient biological system and a novel environment. The same mismatch appears in many other domains of human experience. The craving for high-calorie foods, fats and sugars in particular, is a legacy of an environment in which these nutrients were scarce and valuable, and in which consuming them whenever they were available was the appropriate response. In an environment of food abundance, the same craving becomes a source of chronic health problems rather than a survival advantage. The preference for social approval and the pain of social rejection are powerful, because in the ancestral environment, social belonging was literally a matter of survival. Exclusion from the group meant exposure to dangers that an isolated individual could not manage. The same psychology, transplanted into modern social contexts, produces the compulsive attention to social feedback that drives much of human behavior on social media platforms. The human need for meaningful narrative, for stories that make sense of experience, that locate individual lives within a larger context of significance, is not a culturally constructed preference that sophisticated people can transcend through rational analysis. It is a deep feature of human cognition, a consequence of the way information processing systems evolved to organize and retain experience. The brain that learned, over hundreds of thousands of years, to encode practical knowledge in the form of memorable stories, where the dangerous plants live, how the river behaves in different seasons, what the ancestors did and how it worked out, is the same brain that now seeks meaning and narrative in every domain of experience. Taking that need seriously, rather than pathologizing it as irrationality, is one of the more useful contributions that the deep history of human cognition can offer to contemporary self-understanding. The longing for connection that is perhaps the most consistent thread in accounts of modern psychological suffering also makes immediate sense from the perspective of deep history. For virtually the entire span of human existence, no one was alone. The band was the fundamental unit of human life. Its members were known to one another completely, from birth to death, and their relationships, however complicated, however fraught with the tensions that close living always produces, provided the basic scaffolding of identity and meaning. A person's sense of who they were was inseparable from the community they belonged to. The modern experience of relative social isolation, of being physically surrounded by strangers in cities while lacking the deep, long-term relationships that characterized ancestral life, is genuinely new in human history, and its psychological effects are genuine and significant. None of this is to romanticize the past. Hunter-gatherer life was not paradise. It was genuinely difficult in many respects. Injury and illness were dangerous in ways that modern medicine has made unnecessary. Violence within and between groups was a real presence. The egalitarianism of hunter-gatherer social organization, though admirable in many respects, had limits. And the specific challenges of the contemporary world, the scale of its social organization, the complexity of its systems, the scope of its problems, require capabilities and solutions that the ancestral human toolkit does not fully provide. But understanding the deep history of human psychology offers something valuable nonetheless. It offers context. It offers the recognition that many of the difficulties of contemporary life are not signs of personal failure or weakness, but of genuine mismatches between what we were shaped for and what we are now expected to do. It offers the reminder that the things that actually tend to work, sustained social connection, physical activity in varied outdoor environments, meaningful work with visible results, narrative and storytelling as modes of making sense of experience, are not arbitrary cultural preferences. They are deep requirements of the organism that we are, honed over hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution. No 29. And it offers something else, perhaps most importantly of all. It offers a sense of proportion. In the long view of human history, the real long view, the view that encompasses 300,000 years rather than 5,000, the present moment is an eye blink. The problems of our time, as real and urgent as they are not the first existential challenges that human beings have faced. Our ancestors survived the Toba eruption, which may have reduced the global human population to a few thousand individuals. They survived ice ages that turned most of the northern hemisphere into a frozen wasteland. They survived the loss of entire ways of life, the displacement from familiar territories, the extinction of the prey species their cultures had developed around. They survived, and they adapted, and they kept going. They kept going because of the qualities that are still present in every human being alive today. Not strength in any simple physical sense. Other species are stronger. Not intelligence in any narrow computational sense. There are many things that simple algorithms can do better than any human mind. But something more specific and more remarkable, the combination of cognitive flexibility, social cooperation, narrative intelligence, and adaptive creativity that allowed a single species to successfully inhabit every environment on the planet, to develop thousands of distinct cultural solutions to the challenge of human survival, and to transmit that accumulated wisdom forward across the generations. You carry that inheritance in the structure of your nervous system, in the deep patterns of your social cognition, in the brain's insatiable appetite for story and meaning and beauty, in the way your body responds to open air and physical movement and the company of people you trust. In all of these things, the 300,000-year history of our species is still present and still active. The people who survived the ice ages and painted the cave walls and crossed unknown oceans in handmade boats are not simply historical figures. They are your ancestors, in the most literal biological sense, and they left their signatures in you. Chapter 11. The Unbroken Thread, Carrying the Past into the Future. There is a particular quality of silence that belongs to very old places. Anyone who has stood in a cathedral forest, or at the center of an ancient stone circle at dusk, or beside a river whose banks have been inhabited for 10,000 years, will recognize it. It is not simply the absence of noise. It is something more layered, a silence that seems to hold within it the accumulated weight of all the human presence that has occupied that space before you. A silence that listens back. Our relationship to the deep past is something like that. Not just an intellectual exercise in recovering facts about ancient people, but a mode of attention that, practiced carefully, changes the quality of the present moment. When you know that the ground beneath you has been walked by human feet for tens of thousands of years, that the stars above you have been watched and named and storied by hundreds of generations before you ever looked up, that the emotions moving through your body right now are the same emotions that moved through the bodies of people who lived before agriculture, before writing, before any of the structures we think of as civilization. All of that knowledge shifts something subtle in the experience of being alive. It shrinks the tyranny of the immediate, the anxieties of this particular week, the frustrations of this particular season, the sense of being lost or insufficient that visits every human consciousness at certain moments. All of these remain real, and they deserve real attention and care. But they exist within a context that is vastly larger than they can usually feel from inside. They are one moment in a chain of moments extending back 300,000 years to the first Homo sapiens, who looked up from whatever they were doing and experienced the peculiar awareness of being aware. And that chain, so far, has held through everything. It is worth remembering this as you fall asleep, not as a dismissal of present difficulty, but as a kind of companionship across time. You are not the first person who has lain awake in the dark, turning over worries that resist resolution. You are not the first person who has felt the sharp edge of loss or the confusing ache of longing for something they could not quite name. Those experiences are woven through the entire fabric of human existence. They are part of what it means to be the kind of creature we are: conscious, social, mortality-aware, meaning-seeking, deeply susceptible to both beauty and grief. The people whose story has occupied this long night knew all of those experiences. They felt them, lived with them, made art about them, and rituals for them, and stories around them. And then they slept, as you are about to sleep, under skies that contain the same stars, with bodies that needed the same rest, with minds that were capable of the same dreams. The continuity is real, and it is deep, and it is, in the quietest possible way, a form of comfort, a peaceful return. And so, here we arrive at the quiet end of a very long journey. You have moved through more than 300,000 years of human time tonight, through ice ages and painted caves, through the first graves and the first ocean crossings, through the slow emergence of agriculture and the gradual construction of the world that eventually produced the room you are lying in. You have walked with people who had no names for what they were doing, who simply lived their lives on a planet that offered no guarantees, and who managed, against every reasonable expectation, to keep the thread of human existence intact across depths of time that the mind can barely compass. They were not so different from you. That is perhaps the most important thing this long night has tried to gently demonstrate. Not different in their intelligence, not different in their emotional depth, not different in their need for connection and meaning and beauty, not different in their longing to understand their place in the universe, different in their world, profoundly, enormously different in the circumstances they inhabited and the tools they used to navigate those circumstances, but not different in the essential qualities of their consciousness, in the fundamental character of the minds that inhabited those ancient bodies and looked out through those ancient eyes. The same brain that painted the lions at Chauvet is now lying quietly in the dark, listening. The same nervous system that once tracked animals across an ice age plain is now gently releasing its vigilance into the approaching comfort of sleep. The same deep longing for story that once gathered people around a fire to hear the elders speak has brought you here tonight, to this voice, to this particular way of spending a few quiet hours in the company of the human past. All of that continuity is real. The chain is unbroken. Every link between those early humans and the person you are now held, through every disaster and every bottleneck and every near extinction that the fossil record reveals. And now you are here, at the most recent link in a chain more than 300,000 years long, and the chain still holds. There is nothing you need to do with this information tonight. No action it demands. No conclusion it requires. It is simply a reminder of how long this has been going on, and of how much has already been survived, of all the people who walked before you, each one unknown to history, each one living their full and complex life in whatever era and landscape they inhabited, each one somehow passing forward the thread that eventually reached you. You are the latest dream in a very long night of human dreaming. Let the images settle now. The painted horses moving across cave walls in the light of ancient lamps. The hand pressed against stone, fingers spread. The small fires burning on the open plain under a sky full of stars that have not moved since our earliest ancestors first looked up and wondered what they were. The boats pushing out into open water toward shores, not yet visible, navigated by nothing but knowledge and courage and the deep human trust in patterns that had been observed and remembered and passed down. All of it is still with you. All of it lives in the biology you carry, and the cognition you use, and the stories that still seem, even now, like the most natural way to pass the quiet hours before sleep. Drift now, gently, into whatever comes next, into the slow and healing dark. The ancestors are keeping watch.